Hi, I'm Adam Summer. You're listening to the Yerushalmi Talk podcast with the support of the Yeshivat Devar Yerushalayim in Har Nof, Jerusalem. This is Sheviis, Chapter 8, Halacha 6. If you're following along in the art scroll, we're on 66A1. Today we're going to be talking about how do you harvest Sheviis produce. Now, part of the theme that's going to be coming up is that we're not going to be looking for ways that are going to be normal or specialized for the task of harvesting. We're going to look at something that works, but it's not as efficient, okay? And one of the ideas is that we want to make sure that you can't just come in one day, fully harvest the whole thing, and then you have all this, you've taken all this hefker produce and you have it, and you're going to be tempted to go and sell it. You're going to be tempted to be, doing business with it. Again, a lot of the theme about Sheviis is that it's freely there and available for everybody, but it's available for everybody. So the idea is you take what you need to eat, and then you leave the rest for the next guy. So the Mishnah starts off and it says, figs of Sheviis may not be detached from the tree with the specialized tools one ordinarily uses. And this is a special tool designed for cutting figs from the tree. And the Mishnah says, but he may detach them with a knife. And this is going to basically be, the idea is that, Sheviis crops may not be harvested in a normal way, only in an altered way. And the Mishnah is now trying to define this principle as prohibiting someone from harvesting on Sheviis with the tool that would ordinarily be used, and also trying to do it in a slightly different way. So you can't use the normal tool for the figs, you gotta use a knife. The Mishnah is now going to talk about the processing of Sheviis produce after it was harvested. And it says, by the way, first it's going to deal with grapes because you produce wine. So it says, one may not press Sheviis grapes in a wine press, but he may press them in a kneading bowl. So one of the ideas here, we're talking about a large bowl that's going to be used for kneading dough. And this is not normally used to press grapes because the quantity and the volume is going to be very small. A wine press is designed to do a very large quantity. You can start to do, enough quantity that you can start to do business with it. And what this Mishnah is also teaching us is that we have to alter both the vessel and the amount of grapes he would normally press so that it's only going to be a small quantity. And now we're going to talk about pressing the olives to produce oil. And the Mishnah reads, one may not press olives in the basin of the olive press with a weighted beam. This, by the way, is the normal way to produce and, pound and grind and press olives. And this is really talking about like an olive press and where they grind it, and there's a heavy beam and it weighs down a large stone, and that's going to make it so that you grind out all of the impurities and then you're left with the oil. That's the way it works. You put, I saw a big old-fashioned grinding system for the olive oil when I was in the vacation in the north, and it was still functioning, and they were actually using it. And I was watching how it works, and they lift up the beam and the stone. There's a top stone and a lower stone, and then what they do is they put in all the olives, and it turns. They turn it, and all of the bits come out the sides. It eventually, as you keep turning it, it keeps pushing it out toward the sides until it falls out, and then what's going to be left is going to be the oil. So they're gonna get all this oil and pulp out, and then they're going to separate out the oil and separate it. So this is saying one may not press olives in the basin of an olive press with a weighted beam, but he may pound the olives with a mortar and a pestle or a mortar of the olive press, and he can put them in a small basin to be pressed. So this is talking about where the Tanakhama are saying that you can take a regular mortar of the olive press, but pressing them may not take place in the basin built in the floor. Rather, you can press the olives only in another small-sized basin. And you're not allowed to grind the olives. That's the process I was describing before. So what they're saying is that you cannot grind the olives in the mill of the oil press, but you could go, says the Chazan Ish, and grind them in another kind of mill, or you could take them and squeeze them, but not grind them. And anyway, the Tanakhama is holding that the pressing of the olive oil has to be altered, both with regards to the pressing and also the grinding. It's really in both ways. It's not the way you're going to make olive oil. Rabbi Shimon dissents with the Tanakhama, and he says that he may grind the olives in the mill of the olive press and then put them in the small basin to be pressed. So this is a slight difference. And the Chazan Ish says about this that Rabbi Shimon is holding that one may grind the olives as one normally does in the mill, which is located in the olive press, and after they are ground, he may not press them in the basin of the olive press, but only in a small basin. And Rabbi Shimon is agreeing with the Tanakhama regarding the alterations that have to be made in the pressing. He's only disagreeing on the grinding. So the Gemara is going to give the source of the Mishnah's ruling regarding the harvesting of the Sheviis produce. So where do we know this from? How do we know that there has to be an alteration as the Torah is going to indicate? So the Gemara says, it is written, after growths of your grain harvest shall you not reap. It says, the aftergrowths of your grain harvest you shall not reap, and the grapes you had set aside for yourself you shall not pick. Now, this term to use for the word reap, that's tikzor, and that's going to show like the reaping of grain in a normal way. But that's not the word that it's using. It's using to pick, and it's saying tivzor. That's going to show like a type of picking, like picking grapes. So the Torah, in the wording of the Torah itself, is indicating that when it's done in the usual manner, and it's going to permit it when done in an altered manner. And that's really amazing about the subtleties of which word the Torah uses. And this is really unusual. So let me read it again because it's so brilliant. It is written, the aftergrowths of your grain harvest you shall not reap, and the grapes you set aside for yourself you shall not pick. And again, the idea is when it's talking about the grain, where it's saying reap, okay, it's not using the normal word that you would see for reaping, like in the normal 6 years. It's using the same word of tivzor, which is to pick grapes. And it's saying over here in the grain harvest, it's saying you shall not reap. And that's really showing that it's forbidding harvest only when it's done in the usual way of reaping. And it's allowing it when it's done in an altered way, like if you were picking grapes, which is not normal for grain. So the Gemara is going to question the first part of the cited verse. And the Gemara says that, is then reaping in the manner of the reapers not permitted while with regard to the aftergrowths mentioned in the verse? So we were thinking about what about the regular grain, and now it's talking about the aftergrowths. And the question here, and this, by the way, is elucidated by the Marafulda, that the phrase used by the verse in this Gemara is to refer to these aftergrowths, but is literally being translated as the appendages of your 6th year grain harvest. Okay, that's how the Yerushalmi is writing it, and how the Marafulda is explaining this deeper point about the structure of it. In other words, it's saying that the phrase used by the verse to refer to these aftergrowths refers literally to the appendages of your 6th year harvest, and saficha is appendages. You can find that in Yeshayahu and Isaiah 14:1, and the idea is that only the aftergrowths, now, which can properly be considered to be appended to the 6th year's harvest, are going to be those that grew in the 6th year but are harvested in the beginning of the 7th year. This is the idea of this appendage. But once they attain 1/3 of their growth, this is the fruit attaining 1/3 of the growth in the 6th year, they are considered products of the 6th year, and Sheviis restrictions do not apply to them. So it should be permitted to harvest them even in the normal way. That's going to be the question, what they're trying to get at. And the Gemara is going to explain this. The Gemara is going to say, Rabbi Law says, if this verse has no application with regards to permitted aftergrowths, in other words, those that attain 1/3 of the growth before Sheviis, then assign it to the application with regard to the prohibited aftergrowths. In other words, those that are going to attain 1/3 of the growth on Sheviis and are therefore subject to the restrictions of Sheviis. And the verse is really teaching that these aftergrowths may not be harvested in the normal way, but they may be harvested in an altered way. So let's look at this. So the idea is that, this is the biblical source about aftergrowths. And there's a subsequent rabbinic decree that's going to prohibit the consumption of aftergrowths entirely. Why? Because people were cheating. And they wanted to stop people from secretly planting and then claiming it was aftergrowths. So the problem with secretly planting is you're basically creating a crop of 7th year produce, and you're not allowed to plant on the 7th year. So the Gemara is going to look at this a different way, and of course Rabbi Mana is going to help to clarify that. And another Amarah assigns a different way to look at the verse, and Rabbi Mana, and again, this is, sefachin, right? Sefachin are the aftergrowths. And the idea is that these are not intentionally planted. These are things that, maybe some seeds fell while you were harvesting in the 6th year, and as you're walking around, you sort of embedded it into the ground with your boots, and then it's there and it grows. But this is not an intentional planting. So Rabbi Mana says the verse is actually needed for this because wild vegetables and grasses that grow on their own accord without any planting at all. And the verse is not needed for the grain of aftergrowths of Sheviis, since the later clause of the verse, and your grapes you shall not pick. Effectively, what this is teaching is that this law regarding the grapes, and there's no reason to differentiate between the grapes and the grains, but it's only to differentiate between the wild vegetables and the grasses. And the Gemara continues, says, in order that you not say that since they grow of their own accord and do not come about from any act of planting, they should be permitted to be harvested in any manner. So one of the ideas is that, as Rabbi Mann is pointing out, is that whatever you're doing, right, even if it's going to be growing, whatever you're going to be harvesting, even if it's going to be growing in a wild manner out in the Jerusalem forest, you're not allowed to go and harvest it and pick it in a normal way. You're also not going to be allowed to go work with it in a normal way. So the idea is that they're trying to permit it from being harvested in any manner, specifically for everything, right? So the way this is being looked at by Rabbi Manna is that not just your grain, not just your grapes, but really just anything that grows. And this is really like being used as a hekesh to include wild vegetables in the Jerusalem forest, that you have to have an alteration in how it's being picked. And the Gemara continues, it says, on account of this, it is necessary for the Torah to state that it is forbidden to harvest them in the normal way. So the idea that Rabbi Matt is trying to say is that by, we assign the teaching of the verse to wild vegetables and grasses, and we conclude that it is forbidden to harvest even these growths in a normal way. And Rabbi Manna is using the principle of im enu, which is the inyan im enu, which is Rabbi Law mentions it, and this is to assign the verse an application to wild vegetables and grasses, because he's going to consider this teaching of this verse to be extra when you're going to apply it to grain and the grain aftergrowths, which attain 1/3 of their growth. Rabbi Law is basically arguing that it's not redundant, and he's basically understanding this, that grain and grapes could not be derived from each other. And Rabbi Manna is basically saying this verse is needed so that there should be no doubt about any of the vegetables, that it needs an alteration, so including wild ones. Now the Gemara is going to talk about a Baraisa that bases the laws of the Mishnah on a later clause that the verse is cited. This, by the way, you can see in Torah's Kohanim Bechor Perek 1:3. So this Baraisa says like this. The verse says, the aftergrowths of your grain harvest you shall not reap, and the grapes you had set aside for yourself you shall not pick. This is in Vayikra 25:5 or Leviticus 25:5. And this verse, this latter part of the verse, is teaching, says this Gemara, that from the produce of the land that was protected you may not pick, but you may pick from produce that was left free for others to take. In other words, the idea here, says the Rosh, is that the term of grapes that you set aside for yourself is going to talk about grapes that you illegally protected from others, and you prevented other people from taking it. And this verse is basically prohibiting someone from harvesting those grapes, and not the grapes that were left free in accordance with the Sheviis laws. So the idea, and the way they're reading this is saying that if you've created a protective boundary that nobody can enter, nobody can go harvest, only you're the only one who has access of it, well, you can't do that. It's hefker, and you don't actually own those grapes. So what this is saying is that you're not allowed to go and pick it. You're not allowed to pick it in the normal way of those who pick. And the idea is that, only the produce that's free for everybody to pick, that's what's available to pick, not what you're trying to protect because you don't actually own it and you're violating Sheviis. And there's implications on when you violate Sheviis, because again, we have midrashim that say that people are violating Sheviis, and Hashem, measure for measure, says, okay, you don't want to follow Sheviis, which is a law in the land, no problem, I'm going to send you into exile, and now you can go and you don't need to celebrate Sheviis and observe Sheviis because you're not in the land. And so you can do whatever you want with your produce out there, but you're not in the land anymore. So now you're not violating Sheviis, because measure for measure, over here in the land you weren't celebrating and measuring and doing things with Sheviis. So now you're also not doing it out there. Measure for measure, I sent you out. So based on this later explanation, says the sages in this Mishnah, figs of Sheviis may not be detached from the tree with a specialized tool, and a specialized tool that one ordinarily uses, but one may detach them with a knife. And similarly, one may not press the grapes in a wine press, but he may press them in a kneading bowl. And the Mishnah stated one may not press olives in the basin of the olive press with a weighted beam. Now, the Gemara is going to give an alternate opinion of this. And what are we going to find here? So, so the Gemara says, but the rabbis permitted one to press the olives with a weighted beam. And there's an Amarah who rules on it. Rabbi Yochanan ruled for those of the household of Rabbi Yanai. By the way, Rabbi Yanai was Rabbi Yochanan's teacher. That it is permitted to grind Sheviis olives in the mill of the olive press in accordance with the opinion of Rabbi Shimon in the Mishnah, and to press them with a weighted beam in accordance with the opinion of the rabbis that we just cited in this Baraisa. So the simple reading of this, and by the way, this is not going to be the reading of the Rambam, but simple reading of this as illustrated by the Rosh Cirilio, is that Rabbi Yochanan is ruling contrary to this Mishnah. Okay, now that's a shocker. Okay, it's a shocker that Amarah is going to rule contrary to a Mishnah. Now Rosh Cirilio is going to explain that Rabbi Yochanan was especially lenient, and he's following both the leniencies of Rabbi Shimon and of our rabbis because, and the reason why is because he's holding that today Sheviis law is in force only by rabbinic decree. And when the Tanna Kama and Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai were talking about it, this is going to be in force d'oraita. So now that it's not in force d'oraita, he's going to be lenient on both opinions. That's the idea. Now, the Rambam in Hilchos Shemitah 423 has a totally different understanding. He's going to interpret Rabbi Yochanan as ruling that one may grind the olives and then press them, and olives would normally be pressed twice, once after pounding and once after grinding. And now the Mishnah is mentioning the prohibition of using this tool. And in the Tanna Kama's opinion, they're going to forbid grinding the Sheviis olives altogether. And it's going to basically emerge that Rabbi Yochanan's ruling does not contradict the Mishnah. And the Mishnah is basically forbidding using this kotevi, which is going to be this tool used for pressing the olives. You're going to grind it, and then you're going to use this kotevi, which is going to be to press them and squeeze them. And the idea, says the Vilna Goan, is that only as regards in this later pressing does Rabbi Yochanan rely on the permissive ruling of the rabbis and hold that there's less need to alter the pressing at this second later stage. So in the mind of the Rambam, he's dividing this ruling up into two parts of the phases. And he's saying that on the first one, they're going to be strict, and on the second one, they're going to be lenient. That's how he's reading Rabbi Yochanan's ruling. So the Gemara is going to cite another ruling that Rabbi Yochanan issued for the members of Rabbi Yanai's household with respect to the operation of the olive press in Sheviis. And the ruling is going to be how to render payment to those who were hired to press the olives and do the work. So Rabbi Yochanan ruled for those of the household of Rabbi Yanai that their olive pressers should not take as wages the Sheviis oil that they pressed. Rather, they should be paid in money. And, you're not allowed to create a debt and pay that debt with Sheviis produce. And we covered this, by the way, in Chapter 8, Halacha 4. We just covered this, 3 days ago. The idea is that Rabbi Yochanan is basically saying that if the worker came and says, let me do the work and I'll take as part of my pay the olive oil, well, you've created a debt and you're paying that debt with the Sheviis produce itself, which is going to be the olive oil. Not allowed to do that. So he's saying you got to use the money. And by using the money to pay the worker, you didn't violate this prohibition because you didn't really create a debt. You're just paying him for his labor. And that's going to be the idea. Rabbi Yochanan saying you have to pay him for his labor. And you can't create a debt where you're compensating him based on Sheviis produce. Now the Gemara is going to give the basis for why this ruling is like this. And again, this is echoing this dispute in the Mishnah that we covered in 8.4, and also in a Gemara that was the opinion of Rabbi Yehuda and Rabbi Nehemiah. We covered that 2 days ago, and so that would be 2 shiurim ago, and you can find that where we're covering Sheviis 8.4, that'll be in there. And the Gemara says that he ruled for the household of Rabbi Yanai in accordance with Rabbi Yehuda and Rabbi Nehemiah, which, by the way, is going to be in 8.4. And the idea about that is that, again, you're not allowed to pay a debt with Sheviis produce. And, over there it's talking about, if you take a loaf of bread from a baker and you say, when I pick vegetables of Sheviis, I will give you some. So the idea is that he's allowed to pay the vegetables he collects. But Rabbi Yehuda and Rabbi Nehemiah are going to forbid him to pay with the vegetables. And Rabbi Yochanan is going to disagree with the explanation of the dispute in that Gemara. Instead, he's going to say that the dispute is actually going to be about the permissibility of using Sheviis produce itself to pay the wages of the worker, that you hired to prepare the food. And so the idea is that in this dispute, it's going to be whether you can use Sheviis produce, and that's going to be considered for eating. Because again, the verse in the Torah in Vayikra is saying that it's for you for eating. And, the question is, if you're doing it now for business, is, that really going to be like eating? Really not. So in the dispute, Rabbi Yochanan is ruling in accordance with Rabbi Yehuda and Rabbi Nehemiah that we may not pay a food worker his wages using Sheviis items, and that is why he's going to forbid the household of Rabbi Yanai from paying the olive pressers with Sheviis oil. So the Gemara is going to say a discussion in which the later ruling of Rabbi Yochanan and where it's going to be mentioned, and it was taught in a Baraisa that donkey drivers and porters who transport Sheviis produce and all who work for Sheviis produce, their wages are Sheviis. Now, what is that going to mean when it says the wages are Sheviis? Rabbi Zera says that the Bryce is dealing with permissible Sheviis produce. In other words, this produce came from the field that was left open for all to take. And by the way, the Beur deadline has not come. And the idea here is that the owner is permitted to consume or sell the produce, and the workers are doing nothing wrong by helping him. And therefore, there's no reason to be more stringent than in the case of the Mishnah in 8.4, where the Mishnah is ruling that the wages of the worker do not get Sheviis sanctity. So, again, the question is, what does it mean when it says their wages are Sheviis? And the Gemara says that they may take from the produce with which they work and have their wages paid with the Sheviis produce. In other words, that this brisa does not mean to teach astringency, that it's really teaching that any non-sacred money that they are paid for their labor gets Sheviis sanctity, and that, by the way, is a leniency, and they can be paid for their service with Sheviis produce. So Rabbi Zera is, of course, going to be challenged, and so here's the challenge. So, and that which Rabbi Yochanan ruled for those of the household of Rabbi Yanai, that their olive pressers should not take the wages of the Sheviis oil that they press, but they should be paid in cash, poses no difficulty. For Rabbi Yochanan ruled that in accordance with Rabbi Yehuda and Rabbi Nehemiah, whereas this bryce is reflecting the opinion of the Mishnah in 8.4. Now, we know that Rabbi Yehuda and Rabbi Nehemiah were sugya in 8.4. So, what do we do with this? And Rabbi Hillel says in this Gemara, the bryce is teaching with porters of illegal Sheviis produce. And what does it mean that their wages are Sheviis? And the Gemara says, like that which Rabbi Abahu says in the name of Rabbi Yochanan, that wages earned for working with Nesach wine are forbidden because the rabbis penalized the worker and assigned the wage the status of Nesach wine. And so here, also regarding wages earned for working with illegal Sheviis produce, the rabbis penalized the worker and assigned the wage the status of Sheviis produce. And this then is what the Brisa means, that when it says that their wages are Sheviis. In other words, Rabbi Zera is interpreting this statement that their wages are paid as a leniency, that their wages are Sheviis as a leniency, meaning that they may be paid their wage as Sheviis produce. Now, Rabbi Hilla is interpreting this as a stringency, meaning that any wage paid to them gets Sheviis sanctity because of a rabbinic penalty. And there is a difference about this between the Bavli and the Yerushalmi. You can see the Bavli point in a parallel sugya in Avodah Zarah 62a, also in B. And over there in the Bavli, it's saying that in the case of Sheviis produce, the rabbis penalize only the wages of donkey drivers because they earn large wages, and they did not penalize the wages of ordinary day laborers because the wages are tiny. And another point is that yes, even though he's assisting his employer in violating a Sheviis prohibition, the wages are so small anyway, and he probably needs it for food security. But the Yerushalmi is saying, according to the Chazan Ish, that there's no such distinction. And the Brisa is interpreting it where it's saying donkey drivers and porters who transport Sheviis produce and all who work for Sheviis produce, their wages are Sheviis. And the idea is that, the Sheviis transporters and workers are being penalized for aiding the owner in the violation of the law. And this evidently is going to follow that this Gemara is referring to either protected produce from, where they built an area where no one else could secure it and it wasn't left out to Hefker, or to produce on which the owner did not perform Beur when it was required. And it's not exactly comparable to the case of those who work with Nesach wine, because over there the workers themselves are the ones violating the law. Now, the Rambam in Hilchos Shemitah 6:13 has a different approach, and he's going to understand this Gemara as referring to workers who are themselves violating the Sheviis law. And an example of that would be bringing in from the field more produce than the Torah allows. So the idea that the Rambam is saying is that the sages did not penalize workers who are abetting another person's violation of Sheviis law, such that those who work with Sheviis produce after the Beur deadline. And really, the idea is that Sheviis must be left free for all to take. And, you're not supposed to take more than a certain amount from the field into your house. So there's two ways to look at it. One way could be where, it's penalizing all the workers. And another way to look at it is that it's only penalizing workers who are violating and working with Sheviis produce, where they themselves are actually violating it. So it's not exactly the same as Nusach wine, because in the case of the Nusach wine, the workers themselves are violating the law by making the Sheviis wine or the Nusach wine. And what this is, one way to look at this is that one way they're trying to get at this is that they're, as the Rambam's pointing out, is that it's referring to the workers who are actually violating Sheviis law, like by collecting too much or by working where they've collected from a protected field. So even if they were a worker for a small wage, according to the Rambam, on how this Yerushalmi should be read. It's that, they're basically, what this is trying to say is that they're basically doing work for a landowner who protected the field, let nobody else in, and they're basically doing the work, and basically they're getting a penalty. And basically that's what the Rambam would read this as, where it says that their wages are Sheviis. So we're going to get into Halacha 7, which is going to talk about the restrictions on Sheviis produce, like cooking it. Anyway, have a great day, and it's really important to work on these technical points of halachot and to try to dig into the depths of halachot and derive out of the Gemara these subtleties of law. This is really the highest form of worship, says the Chazan Ish. Have a great day.